for bringing me here. It's really a great honor and a pleasure to be here in a really distinguished environmental humanities community, and also as part of a series on the Anthropocene, which is something that I think we're all thinking about and trying to wrap our mind around. And so over the last couple of years, and in the context of the Sawyer seminar that you mentioned, many of us at UCLA, myself included, have of course been thinking about the shape that the environmental humanities might take and what the important concepts and topics will be that will shape that field. And so it's two new impulses in that field that I'd like to take up today, and that have reshaped thinking and writing in Europe and North America around environmental issues over the last 5 to 10 years. One of those, the city, and the other one, the Anthropocene. So the issue of the city and urban nature, urban art, and writing comes out of something that you may already know, which is that the WHO declared a historical threshold in 2008, the point at which the number of humans who live in cities crossed the 50% threshold for the first time in the history of the species. And here you have it sort of broken down by, so the blue line is world, and then the other colored lines are different regions. This is a sort of diagram that shows the sort of decline of the rural population and the rise of the urban one, and you can see how they cross over sometime around just before 2010. Now, there's been some debate about what kind of density actually counts as a city for the WHO and the various United Nations agencies that have taken up this projection or this insight. But nobody contests the general tendency. Cities around the world are growing, and all future human population growth will either start out in cities or end up there. And we're not talking mainly well-known metropolises here, not like Tokyo, Shanghai, Lagos, or Mexico City. Much of that growth is already happening in cities in China and India that are much less well-known, but that have 7 or 8 million inhabitants, like New York. So the future habitat of humankind is the city, and for a good part of the population, very large cities, whereas the percentage of people working in agriculture is going to continue to shrink. So the ecosystems that will inhabit in the future are urban ones, and that's an invitation indeed to rethink, as Susan already indicated, to rethink how nature functions in cities, but also in what ways cities are part of nature and are in fact nature. And in rethinking these issues, or thinking about how we might integrate cities in our environmental humanities thinking, I've been inspired by 2 classics, one old and one new. One is Raymond Williams's The Country and the City from 1973, which has long been one of the staple texts of the environmental humanities. The other one is Chidana Haruo's Japan and the Culture of the 4 Seasons, which came out 3 years ago. Which surveys the engagement with nature and with country and city in a grand sweep that covers 1,200 years, or from about 800 Christian era to the present day, and foregrounds the centrality of the city-country division for Japanese thinking about nature, much as Williams did in his magisterial book about the English pastoral tradition. So that's sort of one part of what I want to talk about today, is sort of the city as an object in the environmental humanities. The other one is the one that is the object of your series, namely the Anthropocene as an increasingly important framework for environmental debate. The Anthropocene, as you know, has been a really important concept around which debates over how to rethink environmentalism have been sparked over the last 10 years in North America and in Europe, though today not so much in other parts of the world. And it's interesting to think about why in East Asia, for example, the term has had no really measurable impact yet. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start with the Anthropocene, and I'm going to relate it to the science fiction idea of terraforming in ways that I'll show. And then in the second half, I'm going to zero in on the question of the city as the major future habitat of humankind. The city is in various ways the quintessential Anthropocene environment, and the place where nature has been so thoroughly transformed that it isn't even usually experienced as nature anymore. So the challenge in reimagining cities in the Anthropocene means developing a new understanding of cities as forms of nature. And speculative fiction and some kinds of poetry are engaged in prompting us to do that. So my main example will be a science fiction novel by Kim Stanley Robinson, 2312, where various kinds of cities, future cities, illustrate that sort of understanding. But it's also a novel that formally reworks in very interesting ways conventions of the 20th century urban novel. And in the last part of my talk, I'll focus on a recent volume of American poetry that uses the Japanese form of the tanka to explore city as nature. So that's Harriet Mullen's Urban Tumbleweeds. And both Robinson and Mullen, I'll show, use the walk through the city, which is an old motif of urban literature, as a way of presenting a new view of urban space as a novel ecosystem. So let me start with the Anthropocene, and let me just start with some of the things that no doubt have already come up in your series. So a term that was coined in 2000 by the ecologist Eugene Sturmer and the atmospheric chemist Paul Crutzen. So they suggest that rather than the Holocene, which we've inhabited for the last 12,000 years, they suggest that we now live in the age of humans because our species has transformed itself from a biological to a geological agent. We've altered even the atmospheric and meteorological systems of the global ecosystem, and our impact makes itself felt even in places where humans can't actually go in their own bodies or where they haven't gone. So for example, remote terrestrial areas or deep ocean layers are transformed by climate change and seawater acidification, even though we might not ourselves be going there. And this impact, the argument is, will be visible even in the geological strata. Geologists will take until 2016 to determine whether the evidence indeed warrants that change of name. But in the meantime, the Anthropocene, of course, has taken on a life of its own, and at this point, I don't think it even matters anymore what the geologists will decide in a couple of years. With multiple exhibitions and symposia by museums, foundations, and research institutions in Europe, Australia, and North America, as well as a profusion of new publications. There are now 2 journals that have the Anthropocene in their title. And The Economist famously did an issue on it that sought to bring the concept to a more general public. So the implications of the concept have been interpreted in a number of different ways, and I'll discuss some of those in a couple of minutes. But I think there's no disagreement on 2 basic ingredients. One, the idea that nature has been so thoroughly transformed that there's no outside to human agency anymore. So there's no wilderness, no undomesticated realm, and really no easy way of returning to either of them because of climate change. And 2, that this impact and its consequences are global, so that no human community can extract itself from them or live outside them. So it is a fundamentally planetary framework of thinking. Okay, so that being said, I think there are real interesting disagreements on what the implications of the Anthropocene concept are. When you read Crutzen's own summary, the emphasis is overwhelmingly on humans' negative impact on the planetary environment. So in one of the well-known follow-up essays that he wrote to the original one he co-authored with Stormer, he has this long enumeration, which in part already figured in the original essay, where he says, during the past 3 centuries, the human population has increased tenfold to more than 6 billion and is expected to reach 10 billion in the century. About 30 to 50% of the planet's land surface is exploited by humans. Tropical rainforests disappear at a fast pace, releasing carbon dioxide and strongly increasing species extinction. Fossil fuel burning and agriculture have caused substantial increases in the concentrations of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide by 30% and methane by more than 100%, reaching the highest levels over the past 400 millennia with more to follow. And I'm leaving huge chunks out of this enumeration. I mean, these illusion points really, this goes on for quite a long time. So this is a catalog that looks like a series of sober facts, but it nevertheless seems to define the Anthropocene as the sum of all environmental havocs that humans have wreaked on the planet. So from that perspective, the Anthropocene is just a new word to mark the endpoint of the typical environmental narrative of decline. The idea that nature gets worse and dies, goes to hell in a handbasket when modern society arises. But I think if the Anthropocene were just that is just a restatement of familiar environmental narratives about that in the end are apocalyptic in nature, I think it's doubtful that it would have acquired the influence that it has. You see a different view in, for example, the publications of the geographer Earl Ellis and his collaborators. So he said in one of his many publications on the issue, the biosphere has long been depicted as composed of natural biomes, perpetuating an outdated view of the world as natural ecosystems with humans disturbing them. Although this model has long been challenged by ecologists, especially in Europe and Asia, and by those in other disciplines, it remains the mainstream view. Anthropogenic biomes, and he and his collaborators call them anthromes actually, tell a completely different story, one of human systems with natural ecosystems embedded within them. This is no minor change, yet it is necessary for sustainable management of the biosphere in the 21st century. Anthropogenic biomes clearly show the inextricable intermingling of human and natural systems almost everywhere on Earth's terrestrial surface. And these anthromes that Ellis and others postulate resonate with other kinds of terminology that biologists as well as popular science writers have proposed and popularized. And I should put a few on this slide. So you have Kariba and his collaborators. He's the scientific director of the Nature Conservancy, talking about domesticated nature. You have the Australian biologist Richard Hobbs and his collaborators talking about intervention ecology rather than restoration ecology, and about novel ecosystems. And I've put them here in that, I put all the publications in their chronological order. And then you have the popular science writers like Christian Schweger's Menschenzeit, which has just come out this year in an English translation, Emma Maris's Rambunctious Garden, and most recently Diane Ackerman's The Human Age. So all of so the Schwegel and Maris and Diane Ackerman essentially popularized the ideas such as those of domesticated nature and novel ecosystems. And I think it's ideas like these that the Anthropocene now has become a shorthand for. And when you look at these writings, what's interesting about them is an odd mix of description on one hand and then prescription on the other. So take an op-ed piece that Emma Maris wrote with Earl Ellis and with the biologists Peter Kariba and Joseph Mascaro in the New York Times a couple of years ago, 4 years ago, titled Hope in the Age of Man. So they say here, the Anthropocene does not represent the failure of environmentalism. It is the stage on which a new, more positive and forward-looking environmentalism can be built. This is the Earth we have created, and we have a duty as a species to protect and manage it with love and intelligence. It is not ruined. It is beautiful still and can be even more beautiful if we work together and care for it. So, you know, sort of the idea of the Anthropocene as a launchpad for a new kind of environmentalism. The environmental blogger Andy Revkin, who I take it was here earlier this year, and who is the author, of course, of .Earth, echoes that sentiment in a post called Embracing the Anthropocene from the same year, where he says, one clear reality is that for a long time to come, Earth is what we choose to make of it, for better or for worse. It's a celebration in a way, a deeper acceptance of our place on the planet with all of our synthetic trappings and our faults as fundamentally natural. So for Revkin, as well as for Ellis and Maris and Kariba, the Anthropocene is a new environmentalist orientation toward the future rather than the past. It's about celebration rather than mourning. It's about a new sense that humans are able to transform the planet into what we want it to be. That optimism is very marked at the end of Emma Maris's Rambunctious Garden, where she concludes, we forever altered the earth, and so now we cannot abandon it to random fate. It is our duty to manage it. Luckily, it can be a pleasant, even joyful task if we embrace it in the right spirit. Let the rambunctious gardening begin. And then Diane Ackerman becomes almost dizzyingly celebratory in her The Human Age, where she says, at the end, I'm all for renaming our era the Anthropocene, a legitimate golden spike based on the fossil record, because it highlights the enormity of our impact on the world. We are dreamsmiths and wonder workers. What a marvel we become, a species with planet-wide powers and breathtaking gifts. That's a feat to recognize and celebrate. It should fill us with pride and astonishment. Perhaps we also need to think about the beings we wish to become. What sort of world do we wish to live in? And how do we design that human-made sphere? Our mistakes are legion, but our talent is immeasurable, and that's an echo from the beginning of the book. That's sort of her framing assumption, that at this point you sort of feel kind of out of breath. Now, on one hand, I think it's hard not to sympathize with this optimism, especially if you've in the past criticized environmentalist discourse for its nostalgia, its elegiac moods, and the latent misanthropy and the reverence for wilderness, and called for more optimistic storylines, as I have. But it's disconcerting that the environmentalist decline stories are here being questioned by the return to an older Enlightenment narrative. It gives you pause to see the Anthropocene interpreted as, well, we've managed nature anyway, it's all human now, so let's go ahead and manage it better. What that perspective leaves out is that some of the most fundamental human transformations of the planet have, of course, taken place outside of our intention and control. So climate change, toxification, ocean acidification, and biodiversity loss, to name just three of the really, or four of the really big problems, weren't planned or intended by anybody. They came about as side effects of other activities, and many of them so distributed over millions of humans that it took us a long time even to realize that they were happening. So it seems like an odd non sequitur to conclude from these unintended consequences that we will in the future be able to reshape nature according to the plan. So what do we do with this? I mean, so you can go ahead and dismiss this leap in logic as just wishful thinking, which some people have done, as an earnest but misguided attempt to think about ways to deal with global change, as other people have done. Or you can argue with Stuart Brand that we really don't have a choice. And Brand notoriously quipped in the 1970s, we are as gods and might as well get good at it, in the whole Earth catalog. But he has recently changed that slogan to we are as gods and have to get good at it. And that change in wording, I think, implies a different and possibly more tragic sense of what humans' ecological agency has been. Now, whichever interpretation you end up preferring, what's interesting from the perspective of my discipline of literary and cultural analysis is how much the science fiction motif of terraforming underwrites a lot of these visions of the future. That's most obvious, of course, in the varied proposals for geoengineering the Earth's atmosphere to mitigate climate change impacts. There's been a lot of writing about this. So usually when the connection to science fiction is made, it's in a just dismissive sense. Oh, these are science fiction ambitions. Science fiction motifs in general, and terraforming in particular, have also infiltrated recent nonfiction writing on the environment by prominent writers such as Alan Wiseman, Bill McKibben, Naomi Oreskes, Eric Conway, and James Hansen. So Alan Wiseman did The World Without Us in 2007. McKibben's Earth, Making a Life on a Tough New Planet, quite explicitly adopts the trope of humans on an alien planet. So he says toward the beginning of the book, the world hasn't ended, but the world as we know it has, even if we don't quite know it yet. And imagine we still live on that old planet, that the disturbances we see around us are the old, random, and freakish kind. But they're not. It's a different place, a different planet. It needs a new name. Earth. I mean, I don't know how you pronounce it other than it's just Earth, but it's différence, right? It still looks familiar enough. We're still the third rock out from the sun, still 3/4 water, gravity still pertains. We're still Earth-like, but it's odd enough to constantly remind us how profoundly we've altered the only place we've ever known. And you can go on and look at other examples here. So James Hansen in Songs of My Grandchildren has a chapter called Venus Syndrome, which sounds like a sci-fi novel, and has a science fiction vignette in his last chapter. Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, the authors of Merchants of Doubt, have just come out with a dreadful little science fiction tale, The Collapse of Western Civilization, A View from the Future. So what's interesting about it is not the quality of it as literature, but rather why well-established historians of science and environmentalists suddenly feel this urge to translate their findings into the science fiction genre. So seen from the Bill McKibben et al. Perspective, the Anthropocene is in fact a sci-fi trope that calls on us to see the Earth as an alien planet, and that's exactly what the aliens in James Hansen's little fable do in Stones of My Grandchildren. Terraformed by beginners who didn't quite know what they were doing, but who might be trained to do better in the future. And that idea, I'll just note in parenthesis, forms part of a more general drift of science fiction themes and narrative strategies outward from the genre proper to mainstream fiction and mainstream authors and even nonfiction. That's, I think, interesting in and of itself. Now, with that in mind, let me turn to Kim Stanley Robinson's work. Terraforming is the central topic of his epic trilogy, Red Mars, Green Mars, and Blue Mars from the 1990s. So in that trilogy, he paints an extraordinarily detailed, scientifically informed, and sociopolitically fascinating portrait of the engineering challenges as well as the cultural and political conflicts that arise around the terraforming of Mars. These struggles result in an ambiguously utopian new society, and then they map obliquely onto continuing conflicts on Earth, which is still riven by economic inequality, ecological degradation, natural disasters, corporate exploitation, population growth, and military conflicts. So in that dual portrait, terraforming gets caught up in a number of fundamental questions. Should Mars be terraformed, or at least be partially preserved in its original state? Should it be terraformed, or should it be aeroformed? That is, should or shouldn't Earth's ecosystems provide the models for Mars? And once Mars is terraformed, might it offer paradigms that could be applied back to Earth to help alleviate that planet's escalating crises? So those are some of the big questions that the Mars trilogy sets us up for. Now, in 2312, which is sort of a follow-up volume in some sense to the Mars trilogy, it came out 3 years ago, Robinson revisits some of these questions, but he takes them up in a lighter tone and with more experimental narrative strategies. So in the vision of the future that this novel portrays, humans have settled on several other planets, moons, and asteroids in our solar system. And to illustrate how these new habitats have been created, Robinson intersperses his narrative with quotations from a variety of imaginary books, and also with lists that convey a sense of the future world's different voices, and they give you sort of interpretive frameworks for what happens in the plot. Now, one of these quotations is an excerpt from what appears to be a manual on how to create a so-called terrarium. So a terrarium is an artificial mini biosphere that imitates one of Earth's ecosystems. So this book that's quoted within the novel says, take an asteroid at least 30 kilometers on its long axis, hollow out your asteroid. Begin with a light dusting of heavy metals and rare earths. With the soil base cooked up, your biome is well on its way. A lot of terraria designers start out with a marsh of some kind because it's the fastest way to bulk up your soil and your overall biomass. Over time, you can transform the interior of your terrarium to any of the 832 identified terran biomes, or design an ascension of your own making. Be warned that many ascensions fall as flat as bad souffles. So this is obviously humorously styled as a kind of outer space cookbook, and is a manual that gives very detailed instructions on how we build this kind of biome. Now, one of the habitats that has resulted from this kind of terraforming is the capital of Mercury, a city called Terminator. And Mercury, of course, is too close to the sun to support settlements that are directly exposed to it. So that's required an entirely new kind of mobile city that's described toward the beginning of the novel. Terminator rolls around Mercury just like its sunwalkers, moving at the speed of the planet's rotation, gliding over 20 gigantic elevated tracks, which together hold aloft and push west a town quite a bit bigger than Venice. The 20 tracks run around Mercury like a narrow wedding band, keeping near the 45th latitude south, but with wide detours to south and north to avoid the worst of the planet's long escarpments. The city moves at an average of 5 kilometers an hour. The sleeves on the underside of the city are fitted over the track at a tolerance so fine that the thermal expansion of the track's austenite stainless steel is always pushing the city west onto the narrower track still in the shade. The city sliding at its stately pace completes a revolution every 177 days. Round after round, nothing changing except the land itself. And the land only changes because the sunwalkers include landscape artists who are out there polishing mirror cliffs, carving petroglyphs, erecting cairns and dolmens and inuksut, and arranging blocks and lines of metal to expose to the melt of the day. Thus, Terminator citizens continuously glide and walk over their world, remaking it day by day into something more expressive of their thoughts. All cities and all their citizens move in just such a way. You probably recognize the narrative idiom of this description even if you haven't read the novel. The idiom is clearly that of Italo Calvino's Le Città Invisibili, Invisible Cities of 1972. That's why you get the allusion to Venice and the sort of allegorical conclusion. Terminator The mobile city that moves around, that moves like a moon around its planet, attached but not anchored to its soul, exemplifies Robinson's vision of a dynamic form of sustainability, a socio-natural self-perpetuation that never stands still. Now, as the last sentence here suggests, that perpetual movement of change and reinvention doesn't stop at the city proper, but includes large parts of the planet's surface, which the artsier and more design-oriented among the Mercurians keep reshaping in ongoing processes of landscape art. The model here is Andy Goldsworthy, whose work is mentioned a number of times in the novel. They alter the shapes and colors of the geological formations, inscribe them, paint paintings on them, to the point where one of the artists reflects during a visit to a museum on Earth why you would want to paint on a canvas if you could use a landscape or a living body instead. So planet, landscape, city, and humans are in slow but constant motion, and slowly but incessantly transforming both the land and their own bodies through activities that are to varying degrees geological, ecological, and aesthetic. It's an interesting vision, not just because Robinson is one of the very few utopian writers currently living and breathing. As I'm sure you know, by far the majority of novelists in the speculative fiction genre prefer to portray human life on this and other planets as bleakly dystopian. And Robinson, too, paints a somewhat pessimistic picture of Earth in the 24th century, but the human habitats on Mercury, Mars, Venus, and various moons highlight humans' creativity and the inventions of nature rather than their destruction. The terraforming experiments are the prelude for the return of several characters who were born on other planets to Earth, and they try to lend a kind of development aid to a planet with, by then, 11 billion inhabitants that has undergone a 33-foot sea level rise since the 21st century. The protagonist, Swan Er-hong, who's a Chinese-descended artist from Mercury, and some of her other spacer friends, and spacers are just humans born off Earth, find Earth utterly bewildering and frustrating. Decisions that are easy to make in their small settler communities are infinitely harder in Earth's populous democracies. And terraforming decisions that are easy in environments that are not naturally hospitable to human life turn out to be really difficult on Earth, where every acre of land is contested territory in terms of ownership rights, historical memories, cultural traditions, and current uses. Nevertheless, some of these terraforming efforts on Earth bear fruit. Florida, for example, which has gone completely underwater, is rebuilt at a higher level through the importation of enormous quantities of rock from Canada. And in one of the most spectacular scenes in the novel, hundreds of thousands of extinct animals that have been bred in these off-world terraria are re-released into the habitats where they used to live on Earth decades or centuries earlier. Now, this whole idea of terraforming is, of course, not new. It's been around in science fiction since the 1940s. But in Robinson, it's reapplied back to Earth itself. It's no longer only other planets, but Earth that's being re-engineered. And Robinson puts that plot element quite explicitly into the context of the Anthropocene, the idea that humans have already, intentionally or not, transformed their entire planet. So Earth, in that view, is constantly being made and remade, just as Mercury is. So the Anthropocene in Robinson's novel means thinking at a planetary scale and focusing on nature remade by humans. It also means rethinking nature as city, and with that let me move into the sort of second part of my talk, not as an other or outside to the city. And that implies paying closer attention to the green spaces that form part of cities around the globe. Now, gardens, parks, and wild areas in the city have always been focal points for conservationists. More recently, conservation efforts have also focused on the blue spaces of riverbeds, lakes, and creeks. And in LA, of course, there's a major LA river revitalization project underway. And a staggering number of empty lots in those cities, which have spontaneously become spaces for vegetation and wildlife in many places. Beyond that, urban nature also means understanding cities as what some biologists, who I mentioned earlier, call novel ecosystems with properties of their own. We know that cities generate their own temperature environments and that they contain very high biodiversity, biodiversity that hasn't been studied in detail because biologists usually prefer to focus on ecosystems with a good deal of native flora and fauna rather than on the mixes and hybrids that dominate urban space. Now, all of this is, at some level, part of terraforming. It's human-made nature. And you could argue that city building is actually one of the most important terraforming technologies humans have invented. So for environmentalism, that means that Leopold's land ethic has to become an urban space ethic. Now, in architecture, design, urban planning, and urban history, nature has played an enormous role over the last 15 years, all the way from decarbonized transportation, energy-efficient architecture, and urban farming, to what Javier Arbona has called climate urbanism, so attempts to rethink urban planning and design wholesale in view of climate change. So I've put some of the main tendencies within these fields and some of the new strands of research and theory on this slide. So ecological urbanism, environmental justice, landscape urbanism, urban metabolism, urban political ecology, biophilic design, and climate urbanism have all transformed these fields in their assumptions, if not always in their practices. Contemporary urban literature has begun to catch up with these transformations, especially where nonfiction is concerned. Think of the works of Mike Davis or Andrew Ross or Matthew Kahn. But novels and poems that engage with urban ecology in depth remain somewhat rare. There's Patrick Chamoiseau's Martinican novel Texaco and Karen Teyamashta's Tropic of Orange, which do present urban nature in its full complexity, entangled with political histories and current class divisions. But other important urban novels, say China Miéville's The City and the City, Jonathan Letham's Chronic City, William Gibson's Pattern Recognition, or Teju Cole's Open City, either don't engage with environmental issues at all or integrate them as part of sociocultural background noise. So in those novels, the environment only appears by way of the average American citizen's portfolio of neurotic obsessions. On the other hand, novels like Lydia Millet's How the Dead Dream and the follow-up volume Magnificence, which engage very seriously with biodiversity and extinction, tend to cast the city rather conventionally as the antithesis to nature rather than as an instantiation of it. But speculative fiction and film have taken up issues of urban ecology. Give the Disaster movie, despite all of its intellectual and aesthetic weaknesses, which we all know, credit for providing a handy template for turning something like climate change into suspenseful plots, as Roland Emmerich's Day After Tomorrow and Neil Blomkamp's Elysium, among quite a few others by now, show. Another speculative fiction author, Paolo Bacigalupi, combines crises of climate, agriculture, and biodiversity in his award-winning novel, The Wind-Up Girl. Now, in his future, which is about 100 or 150 years down the line, the world's been devastated by sea level rise, and even more by constantly mutating plagues and pests that agribusiness corporations are barely able to stay one step ahead of by constant genetic re-engineering. It's a little bit what you alluded to in your introduction. Thailand is the only country that has been able to offer resistance to the calorie companies, the chemical and agricultural corporations from the north, because it's meticulously maintained an archive of uncontaminated seeds whose genes can be called upon to create new temporarily plague-resistant crops. Bangkok, the city of divine beings, or city of angels, has been saved from flooding by an act of royally mandated civil engineering, a system of dikes, locks, and pumps. But it's invaded by all kinds of genetically engineered mutating plants and animals. Genetically re-engineered nature also includes humans, among them the Japanese wind-up Emiko, so called because her genetic programming includes unnecessary stutter-stop movements, reminiscent of older mechanical imitations of the human that her Japanese gene engineers added just for aesthetic effect. Appreciated for her grace and beauty in her homeland, Emiko experiences Bangkok as a nightmare of discrimination, violence, and sexual exploitation. And city and nation are riven by struggles between the powerful environment minister and the minister of trade over things like commerce and protectionism, nativism or international engagement, and varying alliances with the queen, the commoners, and the foreigners representing the calorie companies. The world beyond Thailand presents an even more apocalyptic scenario of corporate exploitation, power politics, rampant ecological crisis, and mass death. So, as somebody said in a review recently, it's one of those typical bummer futures that are so common. But brilliantly written. Krung Thep goes under at the end of the novel, as cities tend to do in dystopian fiction and film, even and especially when they are conceived on the model of a fortress. So here's, toward the end of the novel, the passage where Bangkok goes under. The destroyed locks and sabotaged pumps take 6 days to kill the city of divine beings. Emiko watches from the balcony of the finest apartment tower in Bangkok as the water rushes in. On the 6th day, Her Royal Majesty the Child Queen announces the abandonment of the divine city. Slowly, the city empties. The lap of seawater and the yowl of Cheshires replace the call of durian sellers and the ring of bicycle bells. At times, Emiko suspects that she is the only living being. She isn't, but she's certainly the one with the best chances for survival into the long-term future. She's very intelligent, she can sometimes move at superhuman speed, and most importantly, she's immune to the new diseases. Along with the Cheshires, which are genetically engineered cat successors, and the multifarious biotech flora and fauna that abounds in Thailand, she stands for the future in Bachagalupi's world, for the new nature that humans have created. And the fact that she does have a future and even a community of similar new people, as the novel calls them, becomes, at the end of the novel, the utopian silver lining on what's otherwise a relentlessly bleak dystopian horizon. Even that doesn't feel like much of a utopia, because it's announced by one of the more sinister characters in the novel, the unscrupulous biotech genius Gibbons, who had already earlier in the novel made the case against conservation. It's an interesting, very Anthropocenic argument. So he says to one of the employees of the Ministry of the Environment, the ecosystem unraveled when man first went seafaring, when we first lit fires on the broad savannas of Africa. We've only accelerated the phenomenon. The food web we talk about is nostalgia, nothing more. Nature, we are nature. Our very tinkering is nature, our every biological striving. We are what we are, and the world is ours. We are its gods. The echo of Stuart Brand here, clearly. You die now because you cling to the past. We should all be wind-ups by now. It's easier to build a person impervious to blister us than to protect an earlier version of the human creature. You cling to some idea of a humanity that evolved in concert with your environment over millennia, and which you now, perversely, refuse to remain in lockstep with. Blister rust is our environment. Pseudoscosis, gene hack weevil, Cheshires, they have adapted. Our environment has changed. If we wish to remain at the top of our food chain, we will evolve. Or we will refuse and go the way of the dinosaurs and Felis domesticus. So in that context, the biologically as well as culturally hybrid, re-engineered, and ultimately flooded city of Bangkok becomes the symbol and the material incarnation of this remade world of the Anthropocene. So the city as a symbol for the negative view of the Anthropocene as a nightmare for all those unwilling or unable to adapt. So for Bachagalupi, the changing nature of the Anthropocene destroys the city. But in Robinson, as we already saw, humans' changes of nature also present new opportunities for creativity. In his novel, it's the alien perspective of characters born on Mercury or Saturn that makes the city accessible as a natural space. And quite deliberately, it creates a contrast to the usual portrayal of cities as either biological wastelands or as playgrounds for a new human-made biology that ranges from dysfunctional to nightmarish. So Robinson, too, imagines a flooded metropolis. In his case, it's early 24th century Manhattan, after that 33-foot sea level rise I mentioned earlier, induced by climate change. And that's, of course, exactly the kind of premise that in Roland Emmerich or in Bachagalupi leads to urban apocalypse. So here's what Robinson does. A few parts of Manhattan's ground still stood above water, but most of it was drowned. The old streets, now canals, the city in elongated Venice, a skyscraper Venice, a super Venice, which was a very beautiful thing to be. Indeed, it was an oft-expressed cliche that the city had been improved by the flood. Swan got off the ferry at the 30th Street Pier and walked on the broad catwalk between buildings to the High Line extension, where people filled the long plazas stretching north and south. Manhattan on foot, workers pushing narrow handcarts on crowded skyways, connecting island neighborhoods suspended between skyscrapers at different heights. The rooftops were garnished with greenery, but the city was mostly a thing of steel and concrete and glass and water. Below her, the slop of water threw up a big ambient sound, human voices and water splashing and the cries of gulls back on the docks and the rush of wind from the canyon of buildings. These were the sounds of the city. The water below was completely chopped up with intersecting wakes. Behind her, down the avenue to the west, mirror flakes of broken sunlight bounced on the big river. This was the thing she loved. She was outdoors, truly in the open, standing on the side of a planet in the greatest city of all. So instead of urban disaster, Robinson's utopian imagination conjures up another Calvino-inflected Venetian-type scenario in which climate change, combined with human ingenuity and engineering, creates a new aerial aquatic cityscape. It seems implausible that the High Line, Manhattan's paradigmatic conversion of an old elevated tram line into a park, would still be there 300 years into the future. But the reference is a strategic reminder of contemporary highly successful projects of urban renewal that merge green and gray city spaces in new ways. To us, the artificiality, even the surreality of the cityscape, may be what's most striking in the description. But the most astonishing and exhilarating thing about it for Swan or Hong, the protagonist from Mercury, is how natural it is. She grows exhilarated at the blue sky, the wind, the ability to move about outside domed habitats, and without spacesuits. The cries of gulls and flow of water. It's one of the most nature-bound environments she's ever been in. And through her perspective, Robinson makes us see even the densest and most obviously human-built cityscapes as ecosystems. So conceptually, as well as in terms of narrative technique, the city here, as in Bacigalupi, provides the template for thinking about the transformation of nature through human agency, for thinking anthropocenically. Robinson reinforces this idea through strategic reuses of narrative techniques that emerged first in high modernist urban novels of the early 20th century. In between the narrative chapters, as I already mentioned earlier, he inserts quotations from fictional books, lists of new inventions and old customs, passages characterizing human settlements on a particular asteroid, moon, or planet. Now, when you think about where he gets this from, the source text closest in time to 2312 that uses a similar technique is David Brin's Earth from 1990. That's a novel that similarly features excerpts from books, online archives, and internet chat groups. This, mind you, 3 years before Berners-Lee introduced the Mosaic browser and started the internet, so it's truly prescient. And in addition, Brin has TV news updates and italicized passages at the beginning of sections that recount the geological history of planet Earth as a kind of Bildungsroman. Now, Brin himself, and for sure, Robinson knows this not since it is, one of the really big environmental science fiction texts. Brin himself imitates very closely John Brunner's technique in his 1968 science fiction novel, Stand on Zanzibar, which is a novel about the global growth of cities and urban violence. And that too used very similar segments from news items, television, and book extracts to develop its portrait of the entire planet. Now, at the time, that technique attracted a lot of attention and not a bit of critique, because it was very innovative in science fiction. Brunner responded to that rather acerbically by pointing out that these techniques had been used for 40 years in modernist urban novels already, but were evidently still too much of the avant-garde to be tolerated by literarily reactionary science fiction critics and readers. And specifically, he mentioned John Dos Passos's use of newsreels and bits of advertising. Now, once you establish that genealogy back to Dos Passos, it becomes easy to see the derivation of Robinson's technique from the mix of discourses in Joyce's Ulysses, Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, Platon's Najat, or Dublin's Bevenarik Sangaplatz. In other words, from the fragmenting of narrative architecture that occurred in modernist novelists' attempts to translate the diversity and simultaneity of the modern metropolis into narrative. So a particular kind of modernist urban storytelling informs Robinson's fictionalization of planetary natures transformed by humans, as it already did in Brunner and Brin. Now there's another detail that highlights this genealogy just as forcefully. In the second half of 2312, you get these short interpolated passages that are titled Quantum Walk. And the one that's titled Quantum Walk 1 starts out like this. A street. Out in a street. Move naturally. Be alert. Don't make eye contact. That will be hard. Hope is the thing with feathers. Buildings massed to the sides of the street. Surface foam silicate, lightly brushed for better footing. By circular broom, times 200 millimeters apart. Each sweep erased part of a previous pair of sweeps. Surcharge and overlapping concentricities. A stranger on the edge of town. Green moss, green grass. Marigold, calendula, yellow. A male scrub jay drops bluely onto flagstone, puddle and gap between street and power strip. Wall of tram station, jay hops and puddle. Humans talking to other humans. Perpetually, they pass the Turing test. It isn't very hard to do. Ask a question, seem distracted. So what you get here, the lack of capitalization and punctuation, the sentence fragments, and the odd spacing, turn these passages into a kind of modern poetry, somewhere in between Emily Dickinson, with her thing with feathers, and Image's poetry. It's also a kind of stream of consciousness, the urban perceptions of a flaneur, with a sharp eye for technological as well as natural detail, and an unnatural mathematical ability. As the reference to the Turing test in the last stanza I've included here betrays, though, not a human flaneur, but a transhuman one, a new kind of person that in the novel emerges from a conjunction of quantum computers, so-called cubes, with other types of computers and artificial intelligence. So it's a new kind of urban subject and subjectivity that is mapped here with some of the time-honored devices of modernist urban novels and poems. So the urban, understood as a certain kind of narrative and a certain kind of stylistic matrix, is imprinted on the novel when it deals with cities, but also when it deals with the transformation of entire continents, moons, or planets. So urban space comes to serve as a thematic trope as well as a narrative template to reimagine land in the Anthropocene, in a context in which humans have thoroughly transformed nature and have done so at a planetary scale. But while Bacigalupi uses his dystopian urban nature as a form of political critique, Robinson, who also has a lot of that critique, moves in the end beyond criticism to imagine new kinds of natural spaces and new kinds of social order. Now, Robinson uses one particular theme through which he articulates his vision of the new social order, and that's walking in the city, and I'll conclude with that. So the quantum walk passages build, of course, on precisely that theme and the central role it plays in modernist city literature. So all the way from Edgar Allan Poe's Man of the Crowd and Baudelaire's Un peintre de la vie moderne to Robert Walser's Ein Spaziergang, Walter Benjamin's work on Baudelaire, and his description of the flaneur, and the various walkers of modernist urban novels, Leopold Bloom, Clarissa Dalloway, Franz Bibelkopf, Hortense Nadja, and so forth. The stroller in these texts is both part of and outside the urban community, and his or her strolling raises the question of whether there is such a thing as an urban community and what it consists of. These questions are compounded by the fact that Robinson's flaneur is not human, so there are questions here about who participates in urban politics and on what terms, who is excluded and on what grounds. How much of what the stroller sees is also within reach of his or her political agency, and what might his or her particular kind of perception contribute to urban politics. At the same time, of course, the figure of the stroller also connects to the walker or hiker in the American environmental imagination, from Thoreau's famous walking essay to Cheryl Strayed's Wild, Lost, and Found on the Pacific Crest Trail, which was made into a movie last year, and so forth. And there's, quite a few critics who have pointed out that connection between the flaneur and the hiker. Kate Sandilands, Rebecca Solnit, and Kathleen Gaskell are the three who've explored that in some detail. Although not really in the context of the Anthropocene. And the strolling here raises the question of urban community and its inclusions and exclusions in yet another way, through the mixed attention to details of technology and nature. So it's both the surface foam silicate and the scrub jay, right? So as in Swan or Hahn's experience of Manhattan as a thoroughly natural space, the cube human's acute awareness of plants and animals in the urban space helps to renaturalize it. It's, if you want to use Walter Benjamin's phrase, it's botanizing on the asphalt in a different way. It's another alien-type perspective that is independent from the ingrained human perception of the city as the antithesis to nature. And so that perspective is able to see its natural and technological constructiveness as just part of the same continuum. The details of everyday perception in this way become connected to questions of community, politics, and democracy. The human city turns into what urban theorist Jennifer Walsh has called zoopolis, or more broadly, a trans or multi-species space. Now, that same strategy also structures a recent text on urban nature that looks on the surface totally different from Robinson's far future utopia. That's Harriet Nolan's poetry volume, Urban Tumbleweeds, and I want to conclude by talking just briefly about that. It's a book that came out in 2013, about a year and a half ago, and it's subtitled Notes from a Tanka Diary. So it consists of 366 31-syllable poems about urban nature, mostly but not only in Los Angeles. The form is adapted from a classical Japanese verse form that tended to express highly stylized perceptions of a highly aestheticized nature. Mullen keeps the syllable count, but then she distributes the syllables over 3 lines in a way that wasn't part of the Japanese form. And she turns her perception to a space that conventionally wasn't supposed to have any nature at all. As the environmental humanists among you may remember, the environmental historian Jenny Price, in her well-known essay 13 Ways of Seeing Nature in LA, makes the claim that there is no nature in the city, one of the many stories that are told about it. So wild, domestic, managed, accidental, literal, metaphorical, all kinds of nature come in front of the stroller's eyes. Now, some of these short poems sound pretty conventional at first sight. Hummingbird alters its course, zooming closer to check out the giant hibiscus flower. Only me in my red summer dress. Or a profusion of oleanders to beautify the freeway and filter the air, though leaf, stem, and blossom are all poison. Or would have said this purple clustered flower looks like a burst of fireworks. But of course it's the fireworks that imitate the flower. So they look conventional, but the question of what's original and what is imitation, what is literal and what's metaphorical, already shows up in the last poem, as do questions of misdirection, misrecognition, and disorientation. And that keeps recurring, among other things, in the poem that the volume's title is derived from. Urban tumbleweed, some people call it, discarded plastic bag we see in every city, blown down the street with vagrant wind. The point here isn't just the seemingly arbitrary attachment of a natural metaphor to a thoroughly artificial product of the consumer world, and one that itself, of course, has become an environmental problem. It's that the nature that the metaphor derives from is itself uprooted and on the move. Even itinerant tumbleweed had roots attaching it to the land before its stem snapped and strong winds pushed it down the road. We hear it much later in the volume. And once you start reading it like that, it's not just Mullen herself who's an urban flaneur. Certainly she emphasizes in a few introductory pages that walking and taking public transit in Los Angeles opened up a different perception of the urban for her and of a nature for which she had no vocabulary, not being a gardener or bird watcher or environmentalist. The switch of perception directly corresponds to the altered awareness of urban nature in Robinson's post-human and transhuman flaneurs. But for Mullen, urban nature itself is the flaneur, is what is constantly mobile, on the move, going where it isn't supposed to go. Hence the oleanders on freeway medians, or the hibiscus, non-natives that have made their way to LA just as Mullen herself has, who wasn't born there. Non-native ice plant on postage stamps represent the Golden State, like a governor whose tongue gets tangled in California. And the poem runs, explicitly connecting introduced plant species to the governor then from Austria. Immigrants who die from eating toxic mushrooms that look like edible ones in their native country. Homeless people locked out from parks that come up in other poems foreground how neither people, animals, nor plants are where they should be in LA, and that's exactly the nature of the city. Nature, like culture, presents itself for Mullen as a heterogeneous assemblage caught up in constant mobility and displacement. Now, all this may seem like a far cry from Robinson's Terminator, which is, after all, a very managed environment for all that it is also in perpetual motion. But remember that inside and outside of Terminator, the citizens of Mercury constantly remake their living environment, as do the designers of the terraria that imitate Earth's biomes. And as we saw, the designers also make up new kinds of ecosystems that they call ascensions. And Muller's Los Angeles is clearly another version of such a human-made biome. Robinson, it is true, tends to emphasize human design, whereas Mullen emphasizes coincidence and the complementary agencies of plants, animals, and soil, and also weather in the way anthropogenic biomes work. But the authors coincide in their goal to understand city and nature as elements of the same transformation processes. Both authors centrally aim to portray the constantly renewed processes of terraforming that create nature in and out of cities as part of nature, and the processes that create and undo cultural and political communities in them at the same time. Both Robinson and Mullen remodel existing literary forms to express their sense of how the urban perpetuates and renews itself. So Robinson's use of high modernist techniques of the urban novel, parallax, stream of consciousness, fragments of multiple discourses, imagist juxtapositions, in combination with techniques of epic, so large-scale narration and enumerations, at first sight contrast with Mullen's minimalist redeployment of a very short verse form imported from a non-Western tradition. But both coincide in juxtaposing fragments, and both use the trope of the urban stroll to tie them together, ultimately to connect the urban flaneur to the ex-urban hiker, and to superimpose literary temples for portraying the experience of nature and the experience of the city. So those are both exactly parallel, I think, in these texts. And both, as I've shown, go one step beyond by turning nature and the city themselves into strollers, not as settings in which only humans move, but other actants also. So ultimately, this technique correlates to their vision of urban communities in which wide varieties of humans as well as non-humans make their presence felt, their voices heard, and their sights seen. A first step toward a more than human city space that turns the idea of the Anthropocene away from its uniquely human focus. Thank you.